Our search for the big picture in the Bible brings us to Genesis chapter 6 today. I encourage you to read along with me if you wish with the beginning of the Noah story. We are not going to take time to read the entire thing or try to make application from the entire thing. We're talking about 3.5 to 4 chapters of the text. But we're going to focus on chapter 6 here today and emphasize the basic concept of what it means for God to destroy the world and what it means for him to preserve mankind in the middle of this. And you'll note, by the way, and you've already noted this, I'm sure if you're following the series, that we are not going chronologically or page by page through the text here. I kind of had it in my mind that we might do it that way, but it's not working out that way. If I were dealing with a class of children or novices who really didn't know the Bible story at all, I would try to do things very differently. But the assumption is here that you know that Noah built an ark, and you know that pairs of every animal were placed on the ark, and God delivered Noah and the ark and the residents of the ark through the flood, 40 days and 40 nights of rain and all that kind of thing. We're going to bypass most of that today. I'm assuming that you've read this story many, many times. But what we're going to do here today, as we've been doing throughout this series, is dig a little deeper and look at the bigger implications behind this and see how this relates, in fact, to our lives as we look at the telling of, arguably, other than the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross itself, the most momentous event in human history, as is described to us in relatively sparse language. 3.5 chapters may seem like a lot, especially in the book of Genesis, where the stories tend very strongly to be very, very short, very truncated. A lot of time is spent on this, but in reality, this is far less attention than the event would ordinarily involve. In fact, I've got books in my library that are based on the story of the ark that go from page and page and page. But what we're going to focus on here is chapter 6 and the beginning of the story and look at some implications for us, starting in verse number 1. When mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, who bore children to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men. When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. These are the family records of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. And Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. Then God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it with pitch inside and outside. This is how you are to make it. The ark will be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. You are to make a roof, finishing the sides of the ark to within 18 inches of the roof. You are to put a door in the side of the ark, make it with lower, middle, and upper decks. Understand that I am bringing a floodwaters on the earth to destroy every creature under heaven with the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. You are also to bring to the ark 2 of all the living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of everything, from the birds according to their kind, from the livestock according to their kinds, and from the animals that crawl on the ground according to their kinds, will come to you, so that you can keep them alive. Take with you every kind of food that is eaten, gather it as food for you and for them. And Noah did this. He did everything that God had commanded him. So a few lessons here to take from this. First of all, the idea of evil and evil corrupting. We have the world that God made and then turned over to mankind. And we see even in the early stages, in chapters 2 and 3, when mankind begins to deviate from God's plan, that the original plan for man and for nature becomes corrupted. And the idea that evil corrupts its surroundings is a theme, again, that is pervasive in the scriptures. God made everything good. In fact, at the end of the sixth day, he looked at everything he said that he had made. The text is at the end of chapter 1, and behold, it was very good. That's what happens when God does things. God does things well. He is incapable of doing things poorly or inadequately. But then things get turned over to human beings, and human beings don't do anything well. Not in God's eyes, at least. We are always falling short. There is none that does good save God, Jesus said. And we don't mean that there aren't any good people in a general sort of sense, obviously. There are exceptions to the rule. But when human beings do human things, the tendency, the very strong tendency, the overwhelming tendency, is for them to take things away from what God has planned for them. We fail in our custody of the world. What we're seeing here in the flood era is a degradation not just of the spiritual relationship between human beings and God, but we also see manifestations of that in the physical world. And this is one of the amazing things about this. God does not decide he's going to destroy mankind. He destroys everything. Every creature, he says here. And that's not to suggest that animals sin in the same way that human beings sin, or that human beings can somehow cause animals to sin or to act inappropriately or whatever. You might be able to make a case for some of that in very specific circumstances. But generally speaking, human beings are the ones who either submit or rebel against God. Human beings are the corrupting influence here. However, the evil that human beings introduce into the world has a corrupting influence. And we see it in a couple of different ways in the text here. We see it in marriage, actually. And there's a lot of discussion about the Nephilim, as they're described here in this text, these giants in the earth, these great ones in the earth. There are a couple of basic schools of thought with regard to them, where they came from, who the sons of men refer to, who the daughters of, or the sons of God rather, and the daughters of men, who they refer to. They are absolutely at odds with one another. One is very true to the immediate context. One is very true to the overall context of the Bible. And both are going to fit the narrative that I'm presenting here today. You can take whichever position you like. I've heard very good definitions for both. And quite frankly, I'm very, very confused about this, to be perfectly honest with you. One school of thought says that the sons of God are angels, and that they cohabit with the daughters of men, human beings, and create this race. That is very true to the context here, because the offspring of this relationship are these heroes, these great ones in the earth. And there's even Nephilim after the flood. Obviously, they did not survive the flood because everything was destroyed, including the Nephilim. But there are going to be some who resemble them anyway, and they take their name, Saul of Gath, or Goliath, rather, of Gath, and people who are like that. There's a small race of giants. The Anakim were in the land when the Israelites came into the land and spied out the land at Kadesh Barnea in Moses' day. There are some people who took that sort of appearance on anyway, and they resembled these stories that they had heard from the flood days. This would explain why these remarkable people were so remarkable. It would fit very much in the context. The problem with that is the entire concept of angels cohabiting with human beings is extraordinarily problematical. Jesus talks about how in heavenly realms they're not married or given in marriage, and granted, being married is not the same thing as having sex or having children, but still it gives the impression, at least, that male and female designations and roles and such do not apply in heavenly realms. Oftentimes angels would resemble human beings, but they're not human beings. They're clearly not the same thing. Is it even possible for an angel to cohabit with a human being? There's a lot of question marks about that. The other understanding, of course, in this context is that the sons of God, rather, has reference to God's people in general, just to say the faithful ones. And that fits the overall picture of the Bible quite well. It doesn't explain the Nephilim, who appear to be a direct consequence of this cohabitation. Why in the world righteous men have sex with wicked women and they have giants? That's not a formula for creating a special race of basketball players or something. That's not the point at all. Clearly, that's not it. But it's very true to the overall picture of the Bible that there is a distinction between righteous souls and unrighteous souls. And it very well may fit even in the general context of Genesis chapter 6, if we're looking at righteous people corrupting themselves by bringing in unrighteous souls at the most personal of levels. This is the story that absolutely pervades the Old Testament over and over again. One of the most pernicious problems that we have here is righteous men finding unrighteous women. And maybe that's what we're talking about here. Maybe that's how the family of Enoch, the family of Seth, the family of Noah himself wound up becoming corrupted because marriage was corrupted, because sons of God, righteous people, were choosing for themselves daughters of men who were not daughters of God. That's at least one possibility. But either way you want to look at it, what you have here is an arrangement that is designed by God, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, that was intended to preserve a legacy of faith, to bring up children in a noble and enriching way, to heighten a person's relationship with God, and is doing exactly the opposite. It is seen simply as sex for sex's sake, pleasure for pleasure's sake. And because of this, at least in large measure because of this, the connection between God's creation and its God is deteriorating to the point where the thoughts of man are on evil continually. And clearly there is one notable exception. We'll talk about Noah here in a second. But generally speaking, the result of this corrupted relationship between human beings resulted in a corruption in their relationship with God as well. And we even see it in the physical world. We're told back in chapter 1 and verse number 28 of Genesis that it was the job of human beings. It was Adam and Eve's job. It was it's our job to take care of the world that is placed in our custody, to tend the garden, as it were. Regardless of what garden you are in, you take care of the world that you are given. And because human beings lose their connection to God, they lose their connection to their calling. And as a result of that, we see the world literally falling apart around us. I'm not suggesting here that littering, for instance, or strip mining, or whatever other kind of crime against humanity or against nature that you might want to talk about is equivalent to blasphemy against the God of heaven or something such as that. But I am saying, and I think the text here is saying, that our relationship with the earth, our relationship with God's calling for our lives, is a reflection of our willingness to submit to his will or failure to do so. And I don't doubt that the world around Noah was becoming increasingly corrupted in a literal, physical kind of way. We see it in the world today. We see people who have no regard for the things of God, who claim to honor the world, to honor the earth, even worship the earth. And yet we see ugliness pervasive in the world because of the mistakes human beings make. And some of that is inevitable. You know, we recognize our mistakes. We deal with it as best we can. We work toward a position where we can correct it. We can talk about pollution and all that kind of ugliness that we see in the world. We've gotten to the point where we can try to take care of that, and hopefully we are doing that. That's a good thing. That's part of our custody. But an indifference toward the blessings that God has given us is an indication of our distance from our Creator and from our original mission. It's part and parcel of the same kind of rebellion that we're seeing here. Retreating from God inevitably leads to a return to chaos. We see this repeatedly in the text. We see over and over again. The less God-centered your life is, the more disorderly your life is. God called the world out of chaos in chapter 1 and gave it fully formed and perfect into the custody of human beings. And the idea, of course, is that human beings were going to serve God and honor God and love God in that relationship, in that garden. And we didn't do that. And we continue to not do that. And because of that, we see a constant pattern of disorder, psychological disorder, physical disorder, all kinds of chaos reigns in the world around us and in our own hearts. This is not the way the world was built originally. This is not the way God wants us to live. He requires us, in fact, to live differently. And when we don't live differently, we are held accountable for that. Now, there is a distinction between what the world was doing and what Noah is doing. And that brings us to faith. Point number 2, faith walks. If evil corrupts, then faith stands out from evil. Faith demonstrates itself. This phrase here that Noah walked with God, that is a profound statement. It brings us back to the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Where Adam and Eve were in the presence of God in a somewhat physical way, a remarkable kind of relationship that has not existed since, except in the person of Jesus Christ, of course, for 30-something years. But regardless of how physical God is demonstrating himself at any given moment for any given person, a person of faith is able to find a way to walk with God. We find our way to whatever form the Garden of Eden may take for us. My podcast that's going to drop on Tuesday, I talk with my friends Tony Mock and Philip Martin, and Philip is famous for his assertion that all good theology begins in the garden. And here we are, we're talking about the garden, and he talks about it in the podcast too. The idea that the Garden of Eden shows the way that fellowship existed before, and there are indications that still exists at a certain level. Exactly how close Noah was to God as compared to how Adam was with God, it's impossible to say. But clearly there was a relationship between the two that was a result of Noah's willingness to live in God's presence, to fulfill God's orders, as it were. Now, not everybody's going to do that. And that goes back to the garden also. We see in the garden when Adam and Eve are called on the carpet to explain themselves, they run from God. They walk away from God in the garden instead of walking toward God. That's what rebellion does. And eventually their relationship with God is severed. At least the relationship they had ended. They continue to have something of a relationship with God, as we do as well. But that original fellowship is broken, and broken forever because of sin. They chose to walk away from God instead of walking with God. We see that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 10. They were trying to hide from God in the garden because of their sin. And eventually, of course, we find in verse 22 that they were not allowed to be in the garden at all. This fellowship is sacred. It's special. It is a blessing not to be ignored or to be abused. And men and women like Noah appreciate this. They're willing to live their life in faith. And living your life in faith is more than just acknowledging I believe in God, or even that I am in a general sense on God's side. Faith is a walk. Faith is a pattern of behavior. And we see this word walk in its equivalence over and over and over again with regard to the faithful ones. We walk in the light as he is in light. 1 John chapter 1, verse 7 says. Our connection with Jesus is a pattern of behavior. It's not just a choice, although in a sense it is a choice, but it's a choice that leads to a series of choices, a series of behaviors, of a pattern of behavior that has exceptions, of course. I'm sure Noah had his problems, just like Adam did, just like you and I do. But in a general sense, Noah loved God, Noah served God, Noah walked with God. That lifestyle, walking by faith instead of by sight, that's what needs to be characterizing us. So no matter how evil the world is around us, righteousness can survive and thrive if the righteous are determined to make it so. You don't have to give in to your environment. You don't have to be defined by your environment. You can be a faithful child of God if you choose to do so. You can walk with God if you choose to do so. It won't be easy because you're going to have a lot of influences pointing you in the other direction. But you can do this. If you ever feel outnumbered in the world, and I promise you, if you're a faithful child of God, you are outnumbered. If you don't feel outnumbered, then you need to assess whether you're actually faithful or not, because narrow is the way that leads to godliness, that leads to heaven. Jesus himself says this. We know this to be the fact. We are horribly, horribly outnumbered. Not 1,000,000,000 though. And it's estimated that there might have been as many as 1,000,000,000 people on the earth at the time of the flood. Even if it's 1,000,000, 10,000,000, 8 souls in the middle of all of that seems impossible. Far, far worse than our situation. If Noah can survive, if Noah can find a way to stay faithful, if Noah can find a way to grace, then certainly we can too. And that brings up the third point. Grace saves. This is the first occurrence of the Hebrew word that is oftentimes rendered grace. God, the text says here that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Favor, that's grace. What a wonderful thing that is. Again, I don't think the suggestion is here that Noah never made a mistake. I'm quite confident that he did. We all do. All sin falls short of the glory of God. Romans 3 verse 23 tells us that. And Noah surely is no exception. But the mistakes were an aberration. They were an error. They were a departure from the norm. His commitment, his plan, his pattern was to walk with God. And because of that, God viewed Noah differently than he viewed the world. You could make a case that Noah is just as evil as anybody else because the one soul that sins shall die. Noah sinned. Again, we're extrapolating from the text, but I think it's reasonable to assume, I think it's a necessary inference, that Noah sinned. We all do. And yet God does not treat Noah's sin the way he treats everybody else's sin. Everybody else dies for their sin. Noah doesn't. Noah and his family survive. They live. And that's the way God is with regard to his faithful ones. He prepares a plan to save the faithful. You don't have to die. Now, I trust that you understand what I mean by that. Physically, of course, we're going to die, but we're talking spiritual death here primarily. That there is a way for us to be saved. And you have a part in that. Sometimes the text indicates a very specific part. I don't know how you would compare the instructions given to us in the New Testament versus the instructions given to Noah in Genesis chapter 6. Noah gives very, very detailed instructions. Build an ark. It looks like this. It's made from that. It's this big and this wide and has this many levels. Very, very specific. And I have no doubt that Noah, being a man of faith, did exactly what God told him to do. The text clearly indicates that. And when God tells us that we are baptized and saved the same way that Noah was saved in the ark, we take that seriously. We believe. And the water imagery, of course, is remarkable, that sin is being destroyed by water, but we come out of the water. We are delivered from the water in baptism. We don't just go down, we come up. And that's why baptism now saves us. The text says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but an answer of good conscience toward God. The point is that we are wanting to be right with God. And the solution is not to take a bath. The solution is to do what God tells us to do, to be God's kind of people. We don't want to say meeting God halfway because that diminishes grace. There's no question that God's grace is going to be what saves us. But if we find that God has put grace in the water, we go to the water. Why in the world wouldn't we do that? That's what faithful people do. Faithful people obey. Noah doesn't say, well, I appreciate you saving me from the flood and all, but why do I have to build an ark? Why can't you just kind of wave your magic wand or whatever it is that God does and just destroy everything else and keep me in some kind of safe bubble? Why do I have to bother building this ark? Why would Noah ask a question like that? God asks this of me. That's what I'm going to do. Jesus called it fulfilling all righteousness when he himself was baptized. I continue to be astounded that people think that they can be righteous without being baptized. And Jesus said, to be righteous myself, I have to be baptized. We're better than the Lord, apparently. That's preposterous. So there's a plan. There's a plan to save righteous people in a wicked world. And God is going to put that plan in our hands. I don't suppose he had to do that, but God in his wisdom made it such. He did it for Noah, and he does it for us as well. And this is the great thing about God's plan. God's plan is going to work. The Lord knows how to deliver righteous souls from an evil world. We talked about that last week, if I remember right, in the Lot story. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 describes Lot as an example of one who can be saved even in a wicked environment, particularly in a wicked environment. He can save us too, and will save us if we will be found faithful, if we will go where he has told us to go, if we will submit to his rules, if we will find grace in his heart. I sometimes talk about putting ourselves on the pathway to grace. Grace is real and grace is going to save us, but we can and we must put ourselves on the path of grace so that it will touch us. And again, why in the world would you not want to do that? What would motivate a true believer to absent himself from God's plan and just trust somehow that God's going to save him anyway? It's not that God's not capable of saving in that kind of situation. It's that God has told us he's going to save us over here. And so that's where we want to be. And if we will do that, if we will submit to this plan, there is a 100% guarantee that we will be saved. And again, I think this is the obvious distinction between someone who's willing to walk in faith and one who is not willing to walk in faith. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Mark 16, verse 16. Well, what if you believe and you're not baptized? That's the question that always comes up. Why do you have to be, can't you just believe and be saved? The text talks about believing and be saved. Yeah, sure, absolutely it does. Well, that didn't say baptism over there. Why is it necessary to be baptized? Let's go back to the beginning. Do you want to be saved or do you want to be lost? Well, I want to be saved. Okay, this passage tells you how to do that. You do this and you're going to be saved. Well, what if I do half of that? Why are we having this discussion? Why are we talking about this? Do you want to be saved or do you want to be lost? These are instructions for being saved. And surely all of the instructions that guide us in the path of salvation are worthy of our respect and our submission. If we do his plan, if we do his will and persist in that plan, persist in that will, it is impossible for us not to be saved. The power of God assures us of that. Why would you want to be satisfied with anything less than that? But here's the thing. This salvation plan that God gives us takes time. If the actuarial tables are any indication, it's not going to take him 120 years. Not for you or for me. At least it's highly unlikely it'll take that long. It did for mankind. It did for Noah. Most people read this 120-year gap here as an indication of how long Noah had to wait, how long Noah had to preach, how long Noah had to build. And if he had this gigantic piece of construction to erect with ancient tools and ancient technology, and he only had presumably his 3 sons to help him out with this, and maybe the women folk as well, it's no surprise it might have taken 120 years to do that. Especially if he's interrupting himself from time to time to go preach to people, which clearly 1 Peter indicates that was happening, that Noah was preaching to people, trying to get them onto the ark too. You know, if you're building a gigantic boat in the back of your property there, somebody comes over to your house and visits, you might have a conversation. What in the world is this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you about this. Why didn't it happen right away? Why couldn't God have just given Noah an ark and told him to get on board? Well, maybe it's because God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Maybe that's part of it. I'm sure at least it's part of it. It would be easier for us, it seems like, if we could just declare ourselves faithful and maybe demonstrate our faithfulness in some way, maybe for a month or a year or 5 years, whatever kind of trial period there might be. Surely that's enough. I've been serving God now for whatever it is, 40 years, close to 45 years. And I've got a pretty solid track record. I've made my mistakes, surely. I fall short from time to time. But I've shown God where my heart is. Surely that's enough. Well, apparently not. Apparently I have to stick around here for a while. And that's okay. I'm not fussing about that. I'll use that extra time to honor God, or try to, just as I've tried to in times past, and what you're trying to do as well. However much time there is. We're like the Apostle Paul, right, in Philippians chapter 1, where he says to depart and be with Christ is far better. Nevertheless, it's for your sake, it's better that I remain. And it appears that I'm going to remain, he says. Well, that's the case with us. COVID-19 hadn't gotten me yet. I'm okay. I'm healthy. Every indication, unless I get hit by a bus tomorrow or lightning or something, that I'm going to be around for a while. It would be nice to go to heaven. But in the meantime, we continue to live our lives here. And we can continue to try to carry out his work here in our own lives and the lives of others. And even if you're just looking at the salvation for our own selves, it continues to be a struggle for us to be what God wants us to be. Walking in the light as He is in the light is an easy concept to voice, but it is very difficult to maintain on a consistent basis, at least on a situation to situation, day to day, hour to hour basis. We continue to fall short. Thanks be to God that grace continues to save us, that God continues to be merciful to us, not just because of the sins we did before, but the sins that we do now, that we commit while we understand God's plan, while we're trying to partake of God's plan. He continues to watch for us. He continues to save us. What a wonderful thing that is. So, in our prayers for the Lord come quickly, which is a biblical concept, let's also pray that this time that God gives us can be used by us and by others of His children to motivate people to get on the ark, to save themselves from this wicked generation, as Peter says in Acts chapter 2. Take some responsibility. Choose to be saved instead of choosing to be lost. Choose to accept grace instead of to spurn grace, or to accept it again if you've fallen from grace. Galatians 5 verse 4 tells us some people had done that. Maybe somebody out there in the audience, internet world is doing that as well. You have opportunity to take advantage of this extra time. Maybe it's a good thing that Jesus hasn't returned yet, because maybe a little extra time will give us a little bit more of an opportunity to come back into His favor, to be what He wants us to be, what Jesus died on the cross to empower us to be. Because without His sacrifice, none of our sins could be forgiven. Not Noah's, not Adam's, not yours or mine, nobody's is going to be forgiven. But He has, in fact, died for our sins. And because of that, we have an opportunity to come to grace. We have an opportunity to get on board the ark and avoid the destruction that is coming to those who have been corrupted by evil. Do not allow these bad things to happen to you. Accept the grace that Jesus offers to you instead. Thank you for joining us. I hope you continue to study this passage out and put it to work in your life so that you can be the kind of Christian that you were supposed to be, the kind of Christian that Jesus died on the cross to allow you to be. God bless.